Hello. Video 2 for this week is going to be about the two other readings that I had you go through while you were looking at the going through the Boris Groys book. The one comes from this book, and it's Irene Anastas and Renee Gabri's piece called Untitled, and then it also is from this text, Pierre Bourdieu's Field of Cultural Production, and you read one of the chapters out of this really dense and lovely book called The Market of Symbolic Goods. And I want to talk about these two texts as they relate to our field work or our field study or our field trip to New York City, because I think there's a really nice conversation that can happen with regard to these texts and regard to this questionnaire that I've put forth to you that I know some of you have completed. What is your art world? A scavenger hunt in valuation and force. And so I've made a little slideshow, obviously, that talks a little bit about these texts and like how they fit into our conversation with regard to this class. I will stop gesticulating with my hands because it gets in the way of you focusing on what I am saying, potentially. And then I'm going to show you some of the answers that I put forth regarding our time in New York City, and regarding this questionnaire in front of all of us, or in front of you previously, but in front of me now, even though it was in front of me previously before. So, all relations among agents and institutions of diffusion or consecration are mediated by the field's structure. So, Pierre Bourdieu is a French sociologist, and he is a sociologist who studies not necessarily art specifically, but he studies more broadly the manner in which things, objects, ideas transmit or translate to a lesser extent, but really exchange. He is, when I was an undergrad, I read a piece by him, and I've since wrestled with him as a thinker. I find him to be pompous, elitist, difficult to actually read, but also difficult to agree with. But he identifies and articulates a kind of working order with regard to this thing we call capitalist markets, that I think is really important. There's been a lot of really, really generative and awesome criticisms of his perspectives that I think point to his importance in this field. And he is a person that very, very few artists actually interface with because of his like academic stratosphere. His work is put outside of the conversation with regard to a lot of art production because well, I've heard a lot of art historians say that it can be too difficult for young students. Young students haven't quite wrapped their head around the worldview that he's talking about, that he's identifying as capitalistic. And so therefore, he's just kind of been written out of a lot of art discourses. And it is my fight and my struggle, and well, it's actually part of this class, to bring him back put him back on your radar, because I think having questions about the art world is a part of every artistic practice, and too few artists approach understanding this idea of an art world in an academic, in a researched, and in a critical way. That's actually the backbone of this course, obviously, but specifically, I think this is a really interesting text for young artists to engage with. I understand it's long, I understand it's kind of tedious, because it's sociology and it's kind of dry, but I think it's really important. So I hope you all got a chance to read through it, problematize it, think about it. It was obviously assigned several weeks ago, several weeks prior to you seeing this lecture. And so I just want to cover it briefly and then talk about what my art world is, or kind of what my art world is, and talk a little bit about what New York City was. So all relations among agents and institutions of diffusion or consecration are mediated by the field's structure. What does that mean? Well, it means that every artistic decision, every curatorial decision, every critical decision with regard to curatorial or artistic production is regulated and also mediated by the field structure. In other words, art criticism reads like art criticism. Art museums look like art museums. Natural museums, natural history museums look like natural history museums, and the discourses surrounding those institutions of diffusion and consecration are different than those surrounding art. And so what Bourdieu is tapping at here is the fact that there is a specificity to a field. And this is something all of you know. You're all researchers in a graduate program, and so this is not news to you. But it's important to think about it as you critique or look at an art world or look at the breadth of art worlds and come to make decisions upon or regarding where you want to see yourself. You make the decision where you put your work. You make the decision how your work is engaged with, where it's engaged with, who you're engaging with, and what kind of artwork you engage with. And those decisions are predicated or should be predicated on an understanding of the field at play or the larger field at play. In other words, you can play a lot of extracurricular sports, but you pick one that best suits your disposition. That's a weird example, but it's pretty simple to get. And so, but what Bourdieu is saying with this quote and with this text is all of those sports are still regulated by the field's structure. The sociology of, actually, hang on. I had to make a little room for my weird little narcissistic video, because that's what we do. Okay, so the sociology of intellectual and artistic production thus acquires its specific object in constructing the relatively autonomous system of relations of production and circulation of symbolic goods. So, the field has its rules. The field has its structures. The field has its institutions for diffusion. Think about that as art museums, as art magazines, as art blogs, as critical voices, and of consecration. Those are the exact same institutions. These things all have rules. And all of the players in these fields, including the artists, understand and abide by these rules to a certain extent. What Bourdieu is saying here in a very problematic way, in a way that I hope ruffles a lot of feathers, is that the artwork that is produced by the field, but almost as though it's through the agent. You understand the shape of your art world, and then you make a decision about what kind of specific object you want to put into that art world. It dictates itself. It sets the rules. And so to a certain extent, it gives the structure and almost the form to these ideas. Think back to the last lecture where we talked about this Marcel Brothers and that idea of autopoietic and the shell, autopoietics and the shell. The mere fact that there is an edge around this market structure means that there's an internal agitation that's happening and an internal conversation that's happening. And it's rare, really, really rare, for an outside form to find its way into this little autopoietic nest. Because of that rarity, that rare occurrence, all of the things that are produced inside of that shell are regulated and therefore predicted by that thing. There's nothing new to be done, is kind of what he's saying. Now, I both agree and disagree with this quote and this idea. I think that thinkers identify the autopoietic edge of their discipline, but they also, because we're humans and we exist inside of a multiplicity of these different structures, we have the ability to conversate or dialogue with people outside of our little institutional shell. And what that yields most of the time is nothing. It doesn't. When you talk to your friend who's an orthodontist, you're not going to take orthodontics back to art and make something immediately. But what it can do occasionally, very occasionally, is it can introduce someone from one discipline to an idea in another discipline, and those two things can begin to share forms. And so while Bourdieu is speaking only about a form and its rigid edge, the edge that is unable or incapable of allowing outside conversation, I'm putting forth, and the other two authors, Gabri and Anastas, are going to agree with this, that there is actually a way of breaking out of these structures. But in order to acknowledge that you are breaking out of these structures, you first have to understand that you are within those structures. So, a slight tangent here. The idea of radical social politics actually necessitates an understanding of us, of people, of civilians being subjugated by a non-radical, normativizing, oligarchical system of politics. You can't rebel against anything if you don't understand that you are being put down. So that's that quote. Then we have this quote. Consequently, one cannot fully comprehend the functioning of the field of restricted production as a site of competition for properly cultural consecration, i.e. legitimacy, and for the power to grant it unless one analyzes the relationship between various instances of consecration. So that's Bourdieu saying in his really lovely Bourdieuian way exactly what I just said. It's kind of. Within these tiny fields, and here he's speaking specifically about the field of restricted production, which is essentially producers making for other producers, and we can see the art world as that. The art world makes art, presents art, makes art ideas for other people that are already within that little autopoietic nest. There are other people that make other kinds of culture that are different and engage with different kinds of humans, but most art in our world is produced almost entirely for this inner circle, as it were. And so the idea is you need to understand how the power structures work in order to fully engage with them and potentially break them apart and turn them into new, exciting, and fruitful adventures in the world of intellectual expansion. But so Bourdieu is giving us this rubric. He's setting it up. He's saying this is how culture works. This is the function of this machine. In order to alter the function of this machine, you need to first study the machine and then make very, very deliberate decisions about the breakdown of this machine. But he almost says that it's absolutely impossible to do that. I say almost because there's other chapters in this book where he does posit potential breaks, little gaps where an artist or a thinker or a cultural producer can wedge themselves and their intellect and potentially open that up a bit more. Like I was saying earlier, this idea that we're all human and we interface in different socio-political, we interface, we know people outside of our disciplines, and that helps this little wedge open up and turn into something else. Now, Bourdieu also talks a lot about the idea of entertainment, the idea of high versus low culture, the idea of an inner group versus an outer group, how all of those things function. And he's articulating all of it in a way that's essentially giving us a roadmap. This is how the world is structured, like I'm saying. Now, to switch gears and go to these folks, Irene Anastas and René Gabri, I'm realizing now I should show you some of their collaborative work because they are artists and they make a lot of really interesting work and that deals a lot with text and writing and power structures and all this stuff. Excuse me. Now, these folks very pointedly and very contemporarily are articulating something that is much more open-ended. What Gabri and Anastas, and I should always say Anastas before Gabri because alphabetical order dictates that being the case. Also, if I wanted to be gender normative, I would place Irene, the female producer of the duo, in front of Renee, the male producer of the duo. But I don't buy into those gender normative things. And so I'm going to say Anastas before Gabri because alphabetical order. Anyway, I really like this reading, and I really like this reading as it relates to a lot of the different ideas that we're talking about. I also really enjoy this reading because of the use of the term dispositif. The dispositif is a kind of armature or a kind of it's the idea of the structure of things that might not be able to tangibly be seen as structures, i.e., the art world is a dispositif. It's really hard to see the full scope of those relationships from an objective position because they're too vast, they're too varied. It incorporates ideas, people, objects, artwork, the past, the future, the potential of the future, so on and so forth. It's so massive that we can't say it looks like this. It has a shape. But we can say that it has a kind of shape that is unknown, and that unknown shape is what's referred to by them and a lot of other thinkers, myself included, as this dispositif. So this dispositif is essentially the thing that Bourdieu is giving architecture to, an explanation to. It's in Bourdieu's writing and a little bit of Groy's writing that we have the articulation of the shape of this dispositif. And what Bourdieu says, as I was just mentioning, is it's very difficult to disrupt the dispositif. It's very difficult to throw a wrench in this particular machine because this particular machine is very, very well oiled and functions adequately. These folks present the opposite side of things. These folks say, actually, there is a way to engage radically with a political sphere, an artistic sphere, and to push this dispositif into different ways of knowing its own self. You can break down a dispositif, again, like I've said earlier, only if you understand how the architecture of it actually functions. It's only after a careful study of a field that you can begin to engage with different rule systems to potentially shift or alter the direction of that game. Now, one of the things that is brought up in this text that is, I can't remember if I've mentioned it in lecture or email or if I've yet to reference it because it's such a fun thing to reference, but if you turn to page in Art and Theory in 1989 to the present, if I can find it, oop, no, looking at the wrong thing, pardon me, is this guy, Fukuyama. Fukuyama. 20 some odd years ago, Fukuyama stood up in the world and said that because of the rigidity of all of our various dispositifs and the rigidity with which they align with one another, a dispositif of art, a dispositif of intellect, a dispositif of racism, a dispositif of feminism, they're all these different things. Because they're so rigidly structured, and because each one of them mines the past in a very explicit way so as to continue or to propagate that structure forward. In other words, the dispositif eats history only in a way that it can reproduce its own self. A power structure's only goal is to continue to be in power. It's to continue to create subjects that understand that they are within and under this power regimen. And so Fukuyama says, well, if each dispositif can mine history in its own way, then there's no such thing as history. History is dead. Radicality is dead. There's no way that humanity can do anything to change what's going to happen in the future because the future is essentially just as much of a cosplay as the past is. I'm going to project hopefully into the future. I'm going to design my entire life around this hopeful projection into the future. And what all of those projections are are hinging on is my relationship to my power structure. So there's no way out of this. Thankfully, we have people like Anastas and Gabri and Deleuze and Guattari who are going to give us ideas that can actually, for lack of a better word, fuck up these notions. They can actually alter them, shift them, make discourse move forward, make these dispositives acknowledge that they are made of a variety of intellects, of a variety of objects, of a variety of different possibilities, and that ultimately, because there is actually no hard shell organic line between one of these architectures of a dispositif and another one, they can and are to be fluid. If you need me to restate that, just go back and watch it again, because I feel like I said pure gold there. Kidding. Anyway, so artists have to find ways to create their own realities, their own spaces, temporalities, organizations of long or short duration, and to make sure the work is not completely subsumed by any institution which takes too facile a relation to the corporatization of art, or corporatization of art, not the corporatization, to the general corporatization of art. In other words, Bourdieu identifies that there are institutions of diffusion and or of consecration. Anastas and Gabri identify these as well, and they say, yes, that is totally true, but artists can and should be in control of their own institutions of consecration and diffusion. An artist with an opinion, which all artists have, has the ability to disrupt certain dispositif structures, to disrupt certain potential future paths, and also to shape history as they see fit. It's artists and art historians that have radicalized things like feminism, queer theory, racial theory, that have presented us with new and exciting terrains to mine and navigate these conversations. To see an exhibition of 5 decades of David Hammond's work was to see the continuation of a conversation, not a stasis of one. And it's that kind of hopefulness that is presented by Deleuze and Guattari, but is reiterated here in this text. Desire is immanent. It is social and takes place between bodies. Right? It becomes an itinerant line, sometimes forming assemblages that can include persons, objects, tools, organic, that should be inorganic, but they wrote non-organic, so that's why I put that little parenthetical with SIC, because that's what you do in these situations. Organic and non-organic matter, which together can threaten existing dispositions of power. Translate dispositions of power into dispositifs, and this slide, this quote, really rounds out what I'm saying here. That we have, as political bodies, as people who want to make our lives worth something, we all, as humans, want to do something. That want is desire. And as they say, that it is a social desire, it is a desire that exists between us and things, us and each other, things and things, so on and so forth. And there's an openness to this conversation that is demanded by these two authors. It has to be open. If you regard it as being closed in the way that Home Dude does, you get one kind of production. You get one kind of making. And this kind of making, this kind of production, usually privileges a historical dispositif. Anastas and Gabri are putting out this possibility that there could be a different kind of dispositif, a future dispositif, constantly evolving future dispositifs of new and exciting shapes and potentialities. And so it's with this, do not click to add a title. Oops. It's with this that I want to have a little break. I'm going to put pause down, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I answered or articulated what my art world was in relation to our trip to New York City. So, hey, okay, so, excuse me. Let me drink from my Boy Scout cup. Boy Scout. Did you know that the Boy Scouts, the Boy Scouts, before they were an American organization, they had a British ancestry, and it was referred to as all the books that were like scouting for boys, um, and because it was the early 19th century or the 19th century, in some point I don't know when, nobody really thought that was a weird combination of words, scouting for boys. Um, but then when the founders' office burned down, they found a collection of pedophilic imagery. And so scouting for boys took on a different connotation. Little known fact. Um, but I am still happy I married a Boy Scout because he knows how to build things. Okay, so I gotta add a little nonsense to every lecture because I'm sitting in my house by myself talking to myself, and so why not be a little zany? Okay, so this is kind of my art world. And I say kinda because one of the things that's really important about these trips to New York City, that's slightly different than trips to, say, abroad locations, is people feel that they have a familiarity with New York City because it's an American city, and most of the people that come through this program are American. And so New York is this place that is a little comfortable. But it's also a place that's incredibly uncomfortable. It's a place not only because the city is what the city is, but also the art fairs in general present a wall. There's a barrier to entry. And sometimes this barrier feels completely impossible to surmount. Other times it feels like that barrier is just a wide open door and anyone can walk through. And it's important to identify when you as a student body go on these trips that you you walk through institutions together or alone, depending on your comfort level with them or your interest in what's on view. Like if you're not interested in the artwork, you're probably walking around with a friend ridiculing all the artwork. If you're interested in the artwork, you lose sight of where all of your fellow compatriots are, and you're just in. I don't know about you, but that was my feeling inside of the new museum. I know it was the end of the trip, but I love you dearly, but you all evaporated to me because that work just was so transfixing and so um, utterly compelling at my core. Like I love music, I love performance, and after such a busy, aggressive week, to walk into that first room with that I encountered, the first room that I encountered was the two piano videos. That was the reward that I didn't even know or anticipate I was going to have on this kind of a trip. And so that's one of the options. The other option is walking around something like the Independent, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of bored. I'm kind of bored. I'm kind of bored. I wonder where everyone is. Um, so all of that is to say that the people that you walked through these kinds of situations with, generally they're people within your cohort, right? It's people that are also sitting in their homes listening to me prattle on while I sit in my home. And that is your art world. You're already in it. One of the things that all MFA programs talk about is the fact that a reason to go and get a graduate degree is to create a different kind of network around your artistic production. And that network is useful in studio critiques. It's useful when organizing things like group exhibitions, which I actually hope some of you are thinking about putting together something for spring break next year when they put out their open call. I'm not really sure when that is going to happen, but put that on your radar because you should do it. But too often, especially on field trips that are organized by school, students don't see the fact that the people that they are walking around with are probably going to remain the people they walk around those spaces with for a long time. After we all left, after you quote unquote evaporated to me inside of the new museum, I met up with someone who I went to graduate school with. who is one of my best friends in New York City, but also one of my principal collaborators when it comes to art. It was this arrangement that not only reminded me of graduate school, of what it was like to be a grad student, which was kind of a nice thing to imagine after having all of you have similar experiences to that. But it also made me realize that I don't talk about this component of it enough. That for me, my art world does have a lot to do with my peer group. It's not fancy galleries, sometimes it is, but it's only the fancy galleries where my friends work that I really feel utterly comfortable in. It's the small Lower East Side galleries that I have connections to, both personal and professional, that I feel the most at home in. And it's because of this at-home disposition that I also find art museums at large to be quite comfortable places to exist. When I travel to foreign places, I always go to the art museum, both as a way to see what the local culture is presenting, but also as just a way for me to feel like I'm comfortable. It's like a big warm blanket. They also often have some of the cleanest public restrooms in most any city in the world. So there's that function of art museums too. And that's a secret that is not really talked about in a lot of the art world. And certainly should never be spread. Like, don't spread the word that you can use the bathroom in any art museum, and there's probably going to be beautiful. There's probably going to be clean. It's probably going to be like huge. Like, it's just like they're great. So that's my 1 minute way to go art museum bathrooms. But this idea that your art world is something that you are to seek out is one of the problems with this scavenger hunt that I assigned to you. Because what the scavenger hunt doesn't ask, and I didn't realize this until really after the fact, what it doesn't ask is where your art world was before this trip. What you acknowledge your art world to be before entering a place like New York City and before going to all of these things that are designated already as art world. You know, the Independent is already art world. The Lower East Side gallery scene, already art world. But there might be some connections that you have that you might not even acknowledge as art world. Your relationship with your partner, your relationship with your best friend, your relationship with your cat, all of these things might have a relationship to your art world. Carly Schneemann, the famed feminist artist, has actually developed a series of works about her and her cat. That's why I bring up cats. She's on my mind right now. And so, you know, for the art museum question, we went to the Met and the New Museum, and we had these various experiences there. But what I want to talk a little bit about are some of the other things that I saw that I just particularly enjoyed, such as, let me move this thing. Such as this. Actually, hang on a second. All right, now you can see this. Marina Naproshkina, the Office of Agit was one of the components inside of the inside of the Agitprop show at the Brooklyn Museum. And I'm putting this here with regard to the question D, what is different about these shows? What is similar? How is the rhetoric of the curator manifested in any corresponding text as well as in the exhibition itself? Well, for the Agitprop show, as many of you know, I hope you were all, I know I said this to you, but I hope it made sense to you, especially because of certain aspects of the wall text, that the show is organized in different waves, that the first wave of the exhibition incorporated a set list of artists. Those artists were then asked to provide artist recommendations for the second wave. And the second wave, which includes Ms. Naproshkina, is asked to recommend a third and final wave. And the third and final wave is actually going to open up in the museum soon, I believe, maybe at the beginning of next week. And so the show is actually going to continue to be fuller and fuller and fuller. And as I was walking through, I'd seen half of the work because I'd seen the first wave. And so I hadn't seen the second wave. So there was new work for me to see, which was cool. Really cool, actually, for a museum to do. And I came upon this thing, so Naproshkina made a series of newspapers that talked about the relationship between revolutionary Belarusian politics and the status quo of the Eastern Bloc world, or the former Eastern Bloc countries, Belarus being one of those countries. And I also thought that this was a very particularly pointed conversation, given we're in New York looking at art, thinking about its relationship to a market. And so I thought it was really funny that this little thing was, or this little illustration was reproduced inside of that newspaper from 2013. Producer, dealer, shop, consumer. So here I am in this agitprop show thinking about how social politics engages with artistic practice, and I find this thing that is a really nice conversation between the social reality of the world at large and the specific relationship between that and the dispositif of the art market. You know, it's like there are structural similarities between these kinds of fields. And Naproshkina, who was recommended by Chito Delatte, who was, for those of you who remember, over the summer, I showed you the video piece about violences enacted throughout the world. And you might not have noticed it, but I was like crying a little bit during showing it to you because it was really emotionally jarring. So I really like that collective, and they presented Naproshkina's work, which I think was awesome too. So couple that with what was going on at Greater New York PS1 and Loretta Fahrenholtz. I had also seen this exhibition before taking you all there as a group. And this work, Ditch Plains from 2013, was one that I remembered, but it wasn't one that that resonated with me for whatever reason in the moment of first seeing it. It could have been because I ran into a friend of mine there, actually in the gallery that was showing this, so I was a little discombobulated. It could have also been that this was the first gallery that I stepped foot in that first time. But I kept thinking about this. And specifically, I kept thinking about it in relationship to the very first few moments of, I'm going to reference it, Beyonce's Formation video. There's a moment where the camera is looking at a young black child. And that child, it's shot at night, so that child becomes almost part of the landscape because, not because of the color of their skin, that would actually be a racist comment, but because they have this lighted piece in their mouth. So the child, with their mouth open, gives the camera something very bright and very gleaming to catch onto. And what that does is it actually pushes the pixels around the rest of that open mouth to the background. You know, figure ground, y'all. It's about how we see things. And that moment, when I saw that video, I was like, I know that. I know that gesture. I know this idea of having a person of color with some sort of lighted fixture on their body to disrupt the way that we as an audience member actually see the body of the performer. And I couldn't place it. And thankfully, I got to go back to this exhibition with all of you and see this. And so I'm just going to play the preview of Ditch Plains for you. So
what happened at the New Orleans?
see what I mean? So there's this kind of cultural similarity is, it's actually something that happens to me quite often. When that's how I remember things, or that's often how I think about popular culture, or as Bourdieu talks about it, the field of mass production or the field of broader production. There is a relationship between what happens in art and what happens in popular culture. Those are not the same thing. You have to understand that they are not the same thing. One is derived for entertainment, one is derived for criticism, and they need to be present in different ways. They need to show us different parts of our world, but they have a relationship. Sometimes art introduces things to pop culture, sometimes pop culture introduces things to art. These are things that happen. And so I also, because of that thought process and not having run into this friend of mine at PS1 this time, I actually just sat and watched this video for a long time, and it's killer. Ditch Planes, like, way to go, Loretta Farrenholtz. One of my top moments from New York City. Okay, now as far as galleries go for number C, I wanted to talk about 3 different gallery shows that really brought to light this idea of objecthood. And those 3 shows are Karen Kalimnik at 303 Gallery. And so you're looking at this thing, you're like, well, Chris, it's a painting. Why, how is that an object? That's different than any other object that's made out of water-soluble oils, because that's what this is. It's water-soluble oils on board or on canvas. But there's also glitter. And so these little moments, you might not be able to see my little cursor, but here you go, one. These little guys and these little guys are moments that are saturated not only with water-soluble oils, but also with, with glitter. And so what that does is it presents us with another screen, another material that we need to negotiate with. The illusion of this being a tropical hurricane, either in Thailand or the Maldives, becomes nullified by the fact that we are accosted with one screen level of glitter. Well, you take that and it ramps up even more in other aspects of the same exhibition when you see this work, Adoration of the Cats. Here you have Kalimnik appropriating a work of art, not necessarily the best work of art. I have a little bit of the hiccups, excuse me. But, and instead of appropriating it in a way that adds levels of seriousness to the thing, Kalimnik, being kind of a jokester, applies a bunch of cat stickers to it. And so the entire exhibition oscillated between paintings that implied or incorporated tiny bits of glitter, doing that thing I was just saying, where they interrupt our screen of information, with these works that also present us with 2 very concrete notions of the object, or 3 really. We have this frame, the object of a framed image. We have the appropriated image inside of the frame, venerating it for some reason, even though it's kind of a cheesy and shitty painting, that also has its own internal frame. But then the third part is the presentation of these stickers. And while it might sound like I'm taking that in this direction of applying a lot of serious intellectual consideration to it, I also was just laughing a lot in this exhibition. There was something that was very buoyant and humorous about the manner in which the intellect was being delivered, the communication there. And so one of the things that is actually core to my art world, or the way that I hunt through the art world, is this level of enjoyment. Now, certainly, I enjoy things like Beyonce's Formation video, but I enjoy things like Loretta Farrenholtz's Ditch Planes at a different level. I can apply different kinds of cultural criticism to them because they are actually more dense. It's the density of the art world and of artworks that I really appreciate and that I respond well to. The next work that I want to talk about comes from a guy named Brian Belotti. That should have an I at the end of it. Whoops. It's called Untitled, and it was part of that group show that we saw at Rachel Uffner Gallery. So it was a group show on the lower level that incorporated these glass-backed technique works by Belote, as well as some other more formally engaged, kind of formally or traditionally formal paintings. This combination of actual things under glass is part of the same kind of object-oriented conversation that I've been thinking about and having kind of with my colleagues and with other artists that I collaborate with quite a lot over the past few years. And so I've known about Brian's work for some time. I've only had the opportunity of meeting him once, really briefly. He's a young guy and does a bunch of really zany things. And yeah, it just is kind of cool. And I've actually seen, I haven't, it's been years since I've seen any of his paintings. And so it was nice to be able to meet the work again and actually to have the work. It wasn't surprising to have the work line up so seamlessly with where my thinking and where my current conceptual head is, as it were. And then the last one I want to talk about is Michael Stam's work that we saw at Terry Goldberg. These were things that show I just loved, and sadly, both my pictures of the back room, where there were the objects from the painting recreated on the desks, on the shelves in front of us, they didn't come out, and there are not good enough quality images on either the artist's website or the gallery's website to show you those. So instead, I'm showing you this work, like Water in the Rain, which you might remember actually has a physical striation to it along the same matrix as these rain lines. And you can actually see them there. It looks like it's almost a wood paneled floor, or yeah, well, a wooden floor. This idea of the object of the painting again being reinforced, again blocking our ability to fully engage or fully negotiate just the image, or not fully, but solely the image, is, I think, a really cool thing that artists are doing, and I really appreciate that work. I've known his work also for some time because my art world is, to a certain extent, New York City, and I understand that how limiting that is. I also understand yeah, just how limiting that is. But by going to New York City so frequently, I'm able to actually catch up on the careers of these artists as they develop over time. I've seen Karen Klimnik shows. I don't know why I stretched out "seen" like you don't believe me. But I've seen a lot of Karen Klimnik's work, and I've really liked her work for several years. So it's cool to see where she's at. Brian's work also kind of checking back in, seeing how things are going. Same thing with Michael. Other artists that I saw on view are also of the same camp. Like, oh, Sonia Kodorovsky's video that we all saw at the Sculpture Center. That's a really interesting track for him to go down. That's not necessarily what I was anticipating from him, but I really, really love that work. Janine Olson, whose work I showed you last semester, had work also in that show. It was really nice to see how her project developed from Here, the work you all saw last semester, into the work that we saw at Sculpture Center, incorporating a 3D printed hand as well as those 3D glasses. Now, the other thing about the art world that I engage with in New York is that it isn't just colleagues from grad school as well as artists whose careers I'm familiar with. It actually incorporates other people that I've just become friendly with over time. When we went into the final gallery before going to the new museum and we saw Larry Baum's, not Larry Baum, Larry, I'm blanking on Larry's last name, at Simone Subal Gallery, I've worked with Simone. So it's nice to pop into the gallery. She also has really incredible taste, I think, when it comes to art. And so we have a lot to talk about when I go in there. And so, but at Sculpture Center, I also ran into a friend of mine who used to be the curator at our Mecca's ICA. And so this notion that the art world has to be really stressful or has to be constantly professional is one that I hope all of you in this exploring were able to kind of debunk and to identify that, you know, buying some bottles of wine and going back to the hotel and hanging out with your cohort is a totally adequate, and actually almost, I was a little jealous when I found out some of you all did that, because it just seems so nice. Like, oh, what a night off. So these are all ways that you are defining and negotiating your own art world. Now, as far as the art fairs are concerned, well, I gotta say, this year I liked fun. I was really into fun and funny and humorous and gimmicky, or whatever you want to, not gimmicky. And so from the spring break fair, there was this show called Material Pressure that I really liked. And Elizabeth Ferry's work, Fruit Face Clock, was really funny. Look at that thing. It's a legitimate clock. It works. But it's got this like funny allusion to a face with bananas as eyebrows and a mouth. And all of these kind of jumbled numbers, breaking apart the associations we might have with the clock and all that other theoretical stuff. But also, it's just kind of a visually appealing thing to look at. So I had a nice time checking that thing out, as well as a lot of other artwork, because that was kind of a cluster, but a wonderful experience. I was actually anticipating the spring break was going to be horrible, and the Independent was going to be great. And I was pleasantly surprised that my opinion was kind of switched. The Independent was a little stale and a little boring, a little corporate, as it were, and the spring break was well thought out, well put together in certain instances, and incorporated a lot of really interesting young work. Now that said, Jess Fuller's sculptures, the water carrier on the right, the orange, and the quencher of thirst on the left in yellow, were hilarious inclusions into the Independent. Like, way to go. I know a lot of you saw me actually seated in these two sculptural chairs. I hope some of you took the opportunity to also take a seat here, because these moments of disruption, when what the rule system of a dispositif puts out is disrupted. Like, you're not supposed to touch art, but here's art you can sit on. Art shouldn't be functional, but here's a clock. I like this kind of buoyancy. There's something very appealing with regard to an audience member, especially somebody who's spent a lot of time investigating art and thinking art's really serious and putting it on a pedestal, so on and so forth. To find these moments where I can just sit in the sculpture and talk to the person who's running this booth at a really uppity fair was really fun. You know, these things are probably, who cares how expensive they are? I don't. I'm not going to buy them. And that kind of conversation doesn't factor into my art world. I know how things are sold. I know how much money people have, and I'm fine with that. If you're a millionaire, cool. If you're a millionaire that likes to buy funny sculptures, cool. We can talk about that. If you're a millionaire that likes to buy boring works of art from boring galleries, we probably don't have that much to talk about. Maybe we do. Maybe we talk about movies. Maybe we talk about how much we like Beyonce's Formation video. I don't know. But, you know, that's my art world. Funny. And that's actually the end of my lecture, which is great because we're at 52 minutes and I want to get this done in under an hour. So even though with all my fits and starts, it's taking me much more than an hour to get this thing down and as close to perfect as possible. Okay, next week we're going to start talking about, where is it? This dude, Derrida. And in also thinking about fun, I just want you to understand that the term that he brings up in that text really early on is hauntology, the haunting of things. And a lot of people talk about ghosts when they talk about artwork, and a lot of people talk about like what your influences are, whose shoulders do you stand on, so on and so forth. And so as we move towards or into Derrida, think about those people, those shoulders that you were standing on, as actually being ghosts. Don't be afraid of them. They're really nice. And on that note, see ya. Have a good weekend.